Hi, this is Mrs. Bustamante. We're going to continue talking about our cellular respiration diagram here. This is part 2 of our video explanation of it. So we just finished talking about glycolysis, saying the point of it was to get 2 pyruvic acid molecules, each that had 3 carbons, to get a net 2 ATP, and to make 2 molecules of NADH, a high energy molecule, we say. So what happens after glycolysis that happened in the cytoplasm? Well, after we have glycolysis, we're going to take a pyruvic acid molecule, and it's going to move into the mitochondria. Specifically, it's going to go through this process called the Krebs cycle. This is the second big piece of cellular respiration, and the Krebs cycle happens in the mitochondrial matrix, or basically this empty space that you see when you look at the mitochondria. And you'll notice that this is the Krebs cycle. It is a cycle. It goes around and around and around, repeats itself over and over and over again, has to go through twice. And the reason it has to go through twice is from glycolysis, we made 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. So we go through this process once for the first molecule of pyruvic acid, and then we're going to go through this process again for the second molecule of pyruvic acid. So first we're going to just talk about one pyruvic acid coming into the Krebs cycle in the mitochondrial matrix. Okay, so this one pyruvic acid enters the mitochondrial matrix, and it's going to combine with a molecule called FAD, and that is going to make a molecule of FADH2, again a high energy molecule. And through this process, it's also going to make 4 molecules of NADH. You'll notice that NADH is the same as the NADH we made from glycolysis, except now we make 4 of them. And in the process of converting this pyruvic acid molecule and making these high energy molecules, we're going to give off a molecule called carbon dioxide. And you'll notice carbon dioxide, or CO2, is just a 1 carbon molecule. But when we go back up and we look at pyruvic acid, we saw that it's a 3 carbon molecule. So instead of just making 1 carbon dioxide for each pyruvic acid, we make 3 carbon dioxide molecules for each pyruvic acid that enters. And in this process, we make 1 ATP for each 1 pyruvic acid molecule. Now, I told you, though, that we have 2 pyruvic acid molecules, so we have to go through this cycle twice. And because we go through this cycle twice, we see double of all these things made. We actually get 2 FADH2s when we take our 2 pyruvic acid molecules, 8 NADHs that we get made, and we get 2 molecules of carbon dioxide. Excuse me, we get 2 times 3 carbon molecules of carbon dioxide because we go through this process twice. And you'll notice the 6 carbon dioxide is in green. That's because when we look at our cellular respiration equation, that's where the 6 carbon dioxide is made, is produced. It's produced from the Krebs cycle. That's how we get it in our overall equation. And we get 2 ATP because every time we go through this Krebs cycle for 1 pyruvic acid, we get 1 ATP, but we go through this process twice, so we get 2 ATP molecules. So what's our main point of the Krebs cycle? We give off our carbon dioxide and we get a little bit more ATP, but really the main point here is that we make these molecules called FADH2 and NADH. And these are really important for the 3rd step of cellular respiration, which is our electron transport chain, or ETC. And the ETC is still happening in the mitochondria, but it's happening in the inner mitochondrial membrane. You'll notice that this looks a lot like other cell membranes we looked at, and the membrane where we saw photosynthesis is electron transport chain happening. So this is happening in your inner mitochondrial membrane. It's like the membrane of all these folds that are happening. Again, you have an outer membrane on your mitochondria. You'll have some inner membrane space. And this is kind of like happening in that division part a little bit. Okay, so here's what happens. We take this NADH that we made, and we're going to pass the high energy electron that we use from it through some proteins that we call an electron transport chain. And again, these NADHs came from the Krebs cycle and they came from glycolysis. So we use these electrons to basically pump hydrogen ions into this inner membrane space of the mitochondria. So we're building up a high concentration, we say, of protons or hydrogen ions, whatever you want to call them, by using the electrons to push them through these proteins, if you will. FADH2 does the same thing, okay? It takes this high energy electron and it uses that energy to push the hydrogen ions through and to build up this high gradient. So these two high energy molecules really push those hydrogens through, make that gradient. That's their whole point of being there in the Krebs cycle. And so now we have a lot of hydrogen ions here. Now eventually this electron kind of falls and we have to combine it, and it falls to a molecule of oxygen. And this is really why we need oxygen in the process of cellular respiration. Really, up until now, we haven't required oxygen, but the electron transport chain needs oxygen. And the reason it needs oxygen is so that this electron can bond with it with some other hydrogens, and it forms a molecule of water. And in fact, it forms 2 H2O. I'm not going to care about you figuring out how you get to the 6 molecules of H2O, but this is where your water's formed when we look at our overall cellular respiration equation. So our water is made in the electron transport chain, and we need this molecule of oxygen, which you'll see as a required reactant, in order for this final step to happen. And this final step that happens is really important. It happens at something called ATP synthase, which basically takes all these hydrogens that we had gathering in a high concentration gradient in our inner membrane space, and it pushes them through. And by pushing them through in this process, it takes ADP and a phosphate and it turns it into ATP. And this is where our hydrogen comes from when we make water too. And what's really important here is that we make 34 ATPs for every 1 glucose molecule that we have. Meaning that's where we make a ton of the ATP that the cell uses. That's why oxygen is so important in cellular respiration, because it's needed in the electron transport chain, and that's where we get most of our ATPs from. So how do we get to 38, right? We took our 34 that we can make from our electron transport chain, we add our 2 that we made from the Krebs cycle, and we add our net 2 that we made from glycolysis. That gives us our 38 ATP. Hopefully this diagram helped you understand how all those 3 processes work together to give you this overall cellular respiration equation.